In the autumn of history, it stood as an impossible monument to division, a jagged scar of concrete slicing through the heart of a city. The Berlin Wall stretched for 155 kilometers, rising 4 meters high to cast a long shadow over the Cold War divide. This was not merely stone, it was a fortified barrier defined by 302 watchtowers guarding a mined corridor where guards held authorization to shoot anyone attempting to cross. Yet, before the final night of liberation, the world began to shift beneath the weight of human will. On the evening of August 19th, the Iron Curtain dissolved between Austria and Hungary at the Pan-European picnic. Weeks later, Erich Honecker stepped down in October, leaving a vacuum of leadership amidst unrest. Even as refugees fled for Bavaria following Genscher's balcony speech on September 30th, the wall remained defiant against the flow of freedom. The Alexanderplatz demonstrations grew louder, and by November 4th, the Interior Ministry published regulations that enraged citizens rather than appeasing them. It was a concrete shadow waiting to fall, holding its breath against the rising tide of peaceful revolution until it crumbled into dust on November 9th. To truly comprehend division, one must measure it against the earth itself. The barrier rose not merely as a single line, but as two concrete realities stretching 155 kilometers across the heart of a divided city. 4 meters high, they formed a jagged scar upon the landscape, separating families and futures with brutal precision. Between these walls lay the death strip, a mined corridor where silence reigned supreme over the night. Here, 302 watchtowers stood like sentinels of a nightmare, their guards authorized to shoot anyone who crossed into this forbidden zone. It was a geometry of fear designed to keep the world apart. Yet even as the concrete hardened in October, the air grew charged with the scent of revolution. On August 19th, the Iron Curtain began to lift at the Pan-European picnic in Austria and Hungary, signaling cracks in the foundation. By late September, refugees departed Prague for Bavaria, under the gaze of Hans-Dietrich Genscher. As Erich Honecker stepped down and new travel regulations enraged citizens in November, the physical wall remained unchanged. It stood silent and unmoving, a monument to will until it could no longer hold against the tide of history. The concrete monolith stood 4 meters tall, not merely as a barrier, but as a machine of exclusion. By the autumn of late 1989, 302 watchtowers punctuated the 15-kilometer corridor that separated brother from brother. This was the death strip, a mined expanse where every breath was measured by seconds. The guards were not merely observers. They held explicit authorization to shoot anyone attempting to flee into this lethal zone. Their rifles were pointed at the living sky, authorized by strict state decree to turn human desperation into cold blood. Yet, the machinery of control began to stutter before the end. In mid-September, Hans-Dietrich Genscher addressed refugees from an embassy balcony, signaling a departure that would soon become a flood. The Iron Curtain between Austria and Hungary had already begun to weep open on August 19th. Even as Erich Honecker stepped down in late October for his successor Krenz, the lethal infrastructure remained intact. On November 4th, thousands gathered in Alexanderplatz, unaware that new travel regulations published on the 6th would only enrage them further. This violence was authorized by law, yet the night of November 9th arrived to dismantle it all with a single quiet word. For 2 decades, the concrete barrier stood as a terrifying physical assertion of political will, 4 meters high and 155 kilometers long. A mined corridor known as the Death Strip separated east from west, guarded by watchtowers where soldiers possessed the authorization to shoot intruders. Yet, in August 1989, the rigidity began to fracture quietly. At the Pan-European picnic, the border between Austria and Hungary opened its gates without sound. Thousands slipped through the cracks, fleeing toward freedom while the regime watched from behind the wall. By September 30th, Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher stood on a balcony in East Berlin, addressing refugees leaving Prague for Bavaria with a promise of departure. The internal machine groaned under the weight of its own contradiction. On October 18th, Erich Honecker stepped down, yielding leadership to Krenz as the SS crumbled. The true pressure mounted into November. Thousands gathered at Alexanderplatz on the fourth day, voices rising in demand for travel rights. Then came the draft regulations from the Interior Ministry on the 6th, a document that enraged citizens. The wall was still standing, but the foundation of trust had vanished completely, and the night of its fall approached with quiet inevitability. The autumn air grew heavy with the scent of impending change. On September 30th, Hans-Dietrich Genscher stood upon a Prague embassy balcony, his voice carrying across the river as he announced their departure. Within days, the first wave of refugees left for Bavaria, fleeing the gray concrete of a city holding its breath. Earlier that month, on August 19th, the Iron Curtain between Austria and Hungary had trembled at the pan-European picnic, signaling the fortress was crumbling. Back in East Berlin, the atmosphere shifted violently with the resignation of Erich Honecker on October 18th, replaced by Krenz. Yet the guards remained armed with orders to shoot within the deadly strip surrounding the 4-meter-high wall. 302 watchtowers stood like sentinels guarding a lie. Tension mounted visibly in the streets. On November 4th, thousands gathered at Alexanderplatz, their chants echoing against the brutal architecture of a wall spanning 155 kilometers. Then came the spark that ignited the powder keg. On November 6th, the Interior Ministry published a draft of new travel regulations that enraged citizens to the point of desperation. The pressure cooker was slowly ready to vent, signaling the final night the wall fell. The massive concrete scar that divided a city for decades finally yielded to the weight of human will. On November 9th, the silence shattered by the roar of engines and voices across the border. In Alexanderplatz, crowds gathered under the gray sky, their faces lit by flickering anticipation of dawn. Just days prior on the 4th, thousands had marched in East Berlin against the 4-meter-high barrier. The Interior Ministry's draft regulations issued on the 6th only inflamed the crowd further, turning hope into urgent demand. Yet behind the scenes, Erich Honecker stepped aside for Krenz in October, and borders with Czechoslovakia were quietly authorized to open for refugees. This reshaped a nation. The wall stood 15.5 kilometers long, guarding a strip of death that once held 300 watchtowers, where guards had authorization to shoot people who attempted to cross the border. Now, the guards slowly lowered their rifles. The night belonged to the living, and the refugees from Prague found passage back home after Genscher's speech in September. By June, plans for deconstruction would begin, erasing the mined corridor and its towers quietly forever, reclaiming the divided land. The world watched the fall. The silence was truly broken.